Shavua Tov, my dear friends. We are at the end of Shabbat, and I didn't have a chance to make this video on Friday before Shabbat, so I will be uploading it now after Shabbat so that we can learn the portion of Rambam, the chapter for today of Shabbat. So today we are continuing in the introduction of the Rambam that he writes of the generational timeline of how the Torah came from generation to generation and how it was passed down over time. We have the written Torah, and of course we also have the oral Torah that was passed and transmitted verbally, all the way till we come to the Mishnah, where Rabbi Yehuda, he was the one who came and compiled the Mishnah, where it was written, and ultimately after that we have the Talmud, the Gemara, where we have many various rabbis all trying to decipher the Mishnah and trying to understand what is going on. So over here, the Rambam now continues in discussing what happened during the days of the Talmud, and let us continue with his introduction. So we discussed yesterday that there were many different rabbis in the days of the Talmud, and they were the ones that were, the Torah was coming through them, being transmitted and passed on and explained in their generation. So he continues and says that all the sages that were mentioned, there was a whole long timeline, a 40 generational timeline. So all these sages that he mentioned were the leaders of the generation when they lived. And they were the heads of the academies of study, the heads of the Sanhedrin, the heads of the Jewish people, very great leaders at their point. And they had thousands upon tens of thousands of students that were learning under their directive. So we were talking about a type of yeshiva system, a study system, a college, where the Torah is being studied with tens of thousands of students studying under the guidance of this great rabbi who was leading the Torah study of that generation. And Ravina and Rav Ashi, who we spoke about last time, they were the ones that actually wrote down the Talmud. They were the last generation where this took place. And as we said, Rav Ashi was the one who wrote and compiled the Babylonian Talmud, and Rabbi Yochanan, he was the one that compiled the Jerusalemite Talmud. And the idea of the Talmud, and the Rambam goes on to explain, what is the Talmud all about? And he says that it's here in order to tell us and explain us what the Mishnah is trying to say, and to get to the depth of it, and to understand all the things, all the various matters that were developed throughout time. You had various circumstances and times and places, and different aspects were dealt with, various stories where we were able to learn different laws and so on, each one in their own period of time. And all in order to get to the clarification of the law, and that was the point of the Talmud, in order to understand what is kosher, what is not kosher, what is pure, what is impure, what is allowed, what is not allowed, etc. Now, except for the basic of the law, for the core of the law, there is also another aspect, another point of the Talmud, which is as equally important. And this is the idea where you had in every generation, you had various sages and prophets, great people, who they would build a fence around the Torah, meaning that there is the basic law that was given over by Moses in the Torah, but then, as the Torah says, that you should observe my precepts, meaning that we have the safeguards which are added on by the various rabbis in the generations, and they were making sure that there were certain things, let's call them stumbling blocks, which people were running into, so they would add on to the law that a certain item would not be allowed, even though according to the basic of the letter of the law, according to the Torah, it is allowed. For instance, let's talk about the idea of not eating milk and meat together. So in the Torah, it talks about meat and milk, that these two items should not be mixed together, prepared and eaten. The rabbis came along at a further point, and they saw that there were many people that are mistakenly, they are mixing the idea of chicken and meat. They're similar, they're used in a similar respect, and they were mixing up these two things, and sometimes mistakes were happening where people said, well, chicken is allowed, and ultimately they were mixing the meat instead of the chicken with the milk. And so too also in regards to milk and cheese, which again are similar in their respect of what they are, and therefore the rabbis came along and said, not only is meat and milk not allowed to be eaten together, but also chicken and cheese are also not allowed to come into contact. So chicken and milk and meat, chicken and milk and cheese and milk with meat, and so on. So this is an added on stringency. So they're not saying that it's, a new law. They're not saying that the Torah says that you're not allowed to eat chicken. No, you're not, but rather the Torah says you're not allowed to eat milk and meat. We want to make sure that we won't come to desecrate this law, so therefore we will add on a stringency, an extra fence around where we won't get so close to mixing the milk and meat. So therefore we will stop a few feet before. So this is the idea of the various safeguards that the rabbis had put into place. Throughout the generations, there were many of these safeguards that were added in place, and it's a very important part of the Torah. These were not simple people, these rabbis who in each one in their generation, they were of great caliber, and they really understood the Torah very well, and they understood people very well, and they made these in order that we should be able to follow the Torah properly without falling out of line, so to speak. So similarly, you also have the various customs and decrees that were put on, which were ordinances which were put into practice at certain points of history. All of these various parts of the Torah. So you have the basic letter of the law, which is written in the 5 books of Moses and the explanation of the mitzvah. But then you also have all the around of it. So you have the various decrees of the rabbis, you have the various customs that were integrated into Jewish people throughout time. And all of these are included within the Talmud. Except for the Talmud, there were also other works that were created earlier on, before the Talmud was actually written, which is called the Midrash, which is the various explanations on the Torah, many stories that were passed down from generation to generation, lots of explanation on the understanding of the Torah. But then the bottom line is that you have the Talmud, which is basically a sum up of all the various laws and all the various customs that were up until that point. They were all written into the Talmud. And the Talmud is a very large, deep set with lots and lots of information included within it. So comes out that Rav Ashi, as we mentioned, and Ravina, his study partner, they were the ones that wrote the Talmud, and they were the end of this era. And this was the end of a very long era in Judaism, where you had essentially from the giving of the Torah, all the Jewish people were relatively in the same area geographically living, where you had the Jewish people, even though they went into exile to Babylonia, and there were big yeshivot over there, as we said, with tens of thousands of students, but essentially they were all in the same geographic basic area and living together. After that, the Jewish people spread out across the world. Then you had Jewish people traveling to Turkey and to Italy and to Germany and to Spain. We have the split of Ashkenazim and Sephardim. We have the Jewish people at that point spread and were dispersed across the world into many different places, and ultimately they were not in contact in the same way that they were before. So therefore, you had many great rabbis, which were very great sages and understood the Torah very well, and they made at their point in history, let's say 100, 200, 300 years later, they had various decrees that they put into place, various customs that were put into practice, but it only served that community and it didn't spread across to the whole Jewish nation. It wasn't accepted across the board, so to speak. So you had in many different places various customs and various decrees and various ordinances that were only for this specific community. So therefore, as we go along and we look around on the map and we see all these different Jewish communities, in the nuance, in the day-to-day customs, so to speak, there's going to be slight differences. And all these customs now are going in their own path in this specific community. And once the Jewish people were not all living in the same place, so you can't say, well, let's say there was a certain decree issued in Germany for the Jewish people living in that area, in Europe. You can't say, well, the Jewish people that are living in Israel or in Spain, which were very far removed from that community, also have to follow that decree that they made in Germany, because they weren't living in the same area, and they weren't in contact with each other in such a complete form. And ultimately, what one community decided, it was not applicable for another one. And at the end of the day, when we're coming to now we have all this literature of the Torah. We're all the way further down in history, and we're looking, and there are hundreds, thousands of various works of laws and customs and explanations on the Torah, which are all given from different perspectives on the time, place, and area which these people were living, these great rabbis. So when we're coming and analyzing them today, and we want to know how we should live our life, so we have to look and to see what, in other words, what makes most sense for where we are living now and here, and what goes back to the core of the basic law, to the letter of the law, what is going along that path. So it's obviously not for me and probably our watchers, our viewers, to decide this, but rather the great rabbis of the generation, which are putting in these ordinances and customs into place, are to assess, is this something which is applicable to us or not, and ultimately come to that decision. And versus the customs and the laws which were put into place before then, talking in the days of the Talmud, and prior to that, that was something which we all, across the board, all Jewish people follow these, because this was a practice that was put into practice into day-to-day life for everyone, all Jewish people. So Ashkenazim, Sephardim, doesn't matter where you come from, we're all following the laws and decrees that were put into place during the days of the Talmud and prior to that. So, and just to say, just a short note over here, that there is a rule according to Jewish law that a generation which comes after another generation, so we have the first generation, you have the second generation are not allowed to nullify a decree that the first generation put into place. So in other words, if we had rabbis 300 years ago who made a certain decree, we cannot today and come and say, well, we understand things a little bit differently, and let's nullify that. According to the system of how the Torah works, which goes from generation to generation. It's like a pyramid, and it's being built upon, and every generation it's being added on from teacher to student. So we're not able to come and say, well, we're smarter than what they were then, let's delete this, but rather something which was put into place, a certain ordinance, we can't just come and nullify. So that's just an interesting point to note over here. But the bottom line is that the Rambam is giving us an understanding into this timeline, how from the days of the Talmud continuing, there were many, many dispersed Jewish communities all around the world, and they were not all following in the nuance according to the same customs, etc. And with that, we finish our class today. Have a very good week, my friends. Shavua tov.